Hi there, welcome to Swanton Learning and Development, Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards. What we're going to look at today is to give you a bit more understanding around what the Mental Capacity Act is and how it applies in a care setting. Oftentimes, people put their family and friends in the trust of our organisation and don't always have a full understanding of what the Mental Capacity Act is. We're here today to hopefully clear up a couple of those either misconceptions or to hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have around the Mental Capacity Act. The Mental Capacity Act 2005 is part of a legislation that encompasses the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards 2009. It was introduced as a way to safeguard people who were in the need of care services where there was an impairment in the functioning of brain or mind, to enable them to support and make their own decisions and really promote a person-centred and a holistic approach to a person's care. Our starting point under the Mental Capacity Act is to always assume that an individual has got capacity until proven otherwise. This is especially important as the individuals that fall under the Mental Capacity Act are often people who suffer from conditions such as dementia, stroke, head injury, mental health conditions. And it's often easy for people to assume that these individuals are not always able to make safe decisions for themselves. So the Mental Capacity Act applies to those people over the age of 18 where there is that impairment to safeguard their decision-making abilities. The Mental Capacity Act sets out 5 key principles on how we make sure that we're not taking away an individual's right to make their own choices. The first principle and the founding principle is to always assume that the individual has capacity. For example, you may have somebody who has dementia and you do not feel that they are safe to go out by themselves because they have dementia. However, what the Mental Capacity Act states is that we have to assume that that individual does have capacity until we have proven that they don't. So the second principle of the Mental Capacity Act is to support the individual to make their own decisions. It's a fundamental in promoting independence and increasing their well-being, and it also means we have to provide any resources that we can to enable this person to make the decision. All information must be presented in a fair and unbiased way so that the individual can make their own choice. The third principle of the Mental Capacity Act is the right to make an unwise decision. I'm sure we all have at some point that everybody has the right to make choices that other people do not agree with or other people think are unsafe. However, when somebody does have the capacity to make a decision, that is entirely their right to do so. And as difficult as that is for the loved ones of somebody who is under the Mental Capacity Act or for the caregivers, it is absolutely crucial that we respect that person's fundamental right to make a decision that we don't necessarily agree with. However, if that person has been deemed to lack capacity, then principle number 4 will kick in, which is that any decision that has to be made on behalf of that person has got to be in their best interest and not the families and not the caregivers and not the companies. It has to be in the person's best interest. And what that actually means is looking at the entire history of that person, a multidisciplinary team of people working together to make sure with the families and the friends involved that that decision is absolutely the best thing for that person and would mirror what they would do when they do have capacity. The 5th option is that when we have made that decision, it has absolutely got to be the least restrictive option that we go for. So we've talked a lot about capacity, but what does capacity actually mean? And what is capacity? So capacity is the ability to use and understand information to make a decision and communicate any decision that's been made. It's time and decision specific. So it's really important to remember that just because somebody might have been deemed to not have capacity for one thing does not mean that they won't have capacity for another decision. So we always have to go on the assumption that a person has got capacity until we prove otherwise, because it is time and decision specific. So who may lack capacity? As we mentioned earlier, people who are over the age of 18 and may come under one of these conditions, such as dementia, stroke, alcohol, brain injury, for example. So when it comes to looking at assessing someone's capacity, what does that actually look like and what does that mean? Well, firstly, there's three fundamental questions we have to ask, which is there an impairment in the function of this person's mind or brain? If the answer to that is no, then we stop, because the Mental Capacity Act will not apply to this individual. Therefore, we should not be going down the route of assessing capacity to make a decision. The second question is, does this impairment impact on the person's ability to make a decision at this time? If the answer to that is no, then again we stop, because it's not relevant for us to continue on. However, if the answer to that is yes, we then move on to question number 3, which is, can the decision wait until a time when the person will have capacity? Again, if the answer to that is yes, then let's wait and encourage that individual to make as many of their own decisions as is possible. However, if the decision cannot wait, then we do have to move to step 2, which is the capacity assessment. So in the capacity assessment, what we do is, when an individual is faced with making a decision and we discuss that decision with them, what we are essentially looking at is, can the person understand the information that is being given to them? Can they retain the information for long enough to make a decision, and in that, a safe decision? So if we were to leave and then come back later on as an example, would that person remember the decision that they've made and any of the risks or benefits to that decision? The third thing that we look for is, can the person weigh up risks and benefits, or the pros and cons of a decision? It's important that we respect an individual's right to make an unwise decision. However, if that person is not able to understand and effectively communicate with us what those risks may be to themselves or to other people, and what the benefits may be, then we cannot deem them to have the capacity to make that decision. And lastly, we'd be looking for, can the person communicate that decision? It can be through any communication means necessary. So we have to start branching out in terms of how we're trying to communicate with individuals, and let's have a look at, can we use non-verbal, can we use picture cards, how can we get the person to communicate their own choices? Do we need an interpreter as an example as well? So as you can see here, it says, if the answer is no to any of the above, the person is deemed to not have capacity. So what that means is, a person may be able to understand, weigh up the pros and cons and tell us what that is, but then when we come back in 20 minutes or an hour's time, they cannot remember that conversation happening or what the decision was. Therefore, we wouldn't be able to say that they're able to make a decision and have the capacity to make a safe decision in this instance. So what that leads to is a best interest decision that's made, and that's usually where the family, friends, social workers, GPs, care home staff, etc. all gather together in a group to discuss what is in the best interest of this person. It's really important that when best interest decisions are made, we do not discriminate. We don't make decisions solely based on somebody's age or appearance, their culture, their religion, their gender. It's extremely important that we do not discriminate when we are approaching decisions on behalf of somebody else. We have to make sure that if we're faced with a particularly difficult or a very contentious decision, that a practitioner will adopt a balance sheet approach. So again, that's where we have to look at the pros and cons to that decision that's been made. We have to keep the person involved as much as fully possible. Having somebody make decisions on your behalf is extremely frustrating, and what we want to do is encourage that person, whilst they may not have capacity, to still be as involved in the best interest decision agreement as is possible, as it is a recorded document, it is a recorded agreement that these steps can be taken in this person's best interest when it is needed, when they do not have capacity. We also have to take into account the individual's past and present wishes, their feelings, any values, their routines. So it really is crucial that the decision follows the individual and not that the individual routines, etc., changes to fit a company or a routine of the business or of the family, etc. So it really is about what's best for the individual. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a full multidisciplinary team of social workers, GPs, nurses, managers, families, lasting power of attorneys, mental capacity advocates, who are all involved in this decision to really ensure that everything has been taken into consideration. And then once it's all been agreed and it's put into place, it enables a smoother form of care, and it also enables a good set of processes that are in place. The Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards 2009, or DOLs, is an amendment of the Mental Capacity Act 2005. It safeguards individuals who are deemed to lack capacity and where there is a need for an individual, company or care provider to deprive somebody of their liberty. And what that really means is where a restraint or restriction has to be applied. Now, when you think of a restraint or restriction, you might automatically think of, somebody being strapped down to a bed as an example, but that's really not what it means. A restraint or restriction in this instance could be if somebody was to go out by themselves, are they able to do so? And if they're not, and they actually need a member of staff to support them to make sure they don't get lost or hurt, then actually we're depriving them of their liberty. So we'll have a look at that a little bit later on. It's just really important to understand with the wording here that a restraint or a restriction could take many forms and could even be verbal as well. So it only allows the restraint or restriction to be used if they're in an individual's best interest. So when we feel like we are going to be depriving somebody of their liberty by having to impose a restraint or a restriction, we have got to legally apply for the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguard, or the DOLs. Not everybody is eligible for DOLs. People must be over the age of 18 and live in either England or Wales, and they must be deemed to not have capacity to consent to the restraint or restriction that's been imposed. Also, any of the restraints or restrictions that have been imposed have got to be in the individual's best interest. We also have to be mindful and explore fully if the individual is suffering from any other mental health disorder, and if they are also eligible under the Mental Capacity Act as well. So where does DOLs apply? It applies to people who are in a care home or hospital and are deemed to not have capacity to consent to care arrangements. That includes where there are plans to move a person to a care home or hospital where they may be deprived of their liberty. And remember, I said earlier, depriving somebody of their liberty isn't always the worst case scenario. For example, it might be that there is a keypad on the unit to prevent a person with dementia leaving the building, potentially becoming lost or hurt. So we would have to apply for DOLs in that situation to ensure that we were not depriving somebody of their liberty, and to allow for that restraint or that restriction to be put in place of the keypad lock for that individual as well. To know if you are depriving somebody of their liberty, you need to ask yourself two questions. Is the person free to leave, and are they under continual supervision? If that person is not free to leave or is under continual supervision, then you are depriving them of their liberty. So it's really important to understand where that line comes in between wanting to support somebody and make sure somebody is safe, and understanding when we are potentially depriving somebody of their liberty unintentionally by enforcing yourself, a family member, a carer, to go along with an individual to everywhere that they go, or refuse them to make certain decisions that they might want to make, or to put in place restrictions that would stop them doing things that they would like to do. So we've already touched on a couple of these, but as you can see here, there's some different examples of restraint or restriction. Expecting residents to spend most of their days in the same way and in the same place. A care plan that says someone can only go out into the community with an escort, for example. It may be set times for visits, or it could be, for example, restricted contact with families where we have to safeguard somebody. It could also be just telling somebody if they don't stop they will be restrained, which formulates a restriction or a restraint. It may be that we have to use some form of covert medication where an individual has started to refuse the medication because their condition has declined. However, the family, the GP, the person previous to the lack of capacity was making the decision to take the medication, all history involved. It's been deemed in its best interest for that person to make the medication and take the medication, so we would go down the route of covert medication for that individual. We would need a DOLs for that to be able to do that as well. When applying for a DOLs, we have to evidence how the restriction or restraint that's been put in place